Okay. All right, we will start this evening. I hope everybody's doing okay as the world of COVID keeps making life more miserable for all of us. All right, to start with, we will begin looking at this week's Torah portion as we usually do. We are now in the second Torah portion of the book of Exodus, Sefer Shmot. And we are going to begin in this week's Torah portion the contest, not between Moshe and Paro, really, but the contest between God and Paro, because it's really God is really the agent here. Moses is merely the person coming through. No, that's the wording. Poor wording. Moses is God's agent, but the real struggle is between God and Paro. When Moshe mentions God's name to Paro last week, Pharaoh says, I don't know this Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, I don't know this Lord. And so really it's seen as a contest between Paro and God. So we begin first with God reassuring Moshe that he is going to indeed save the people, and that Pharaoh ultimately will listen to him and send Israel out. But it's going to take some effort until that comes about. And before we actually start the contest between them, interestingly enough, the Torah reviews the ancestry of the people of Israel. Starts with Reuven, the eldest son of Jacob. And then it goes on through that listing. And then it goes to, here are the names of Levi's sons by their lineage, Gershom, Kahat, and Merari. And then it gives a little bit about that. And then really it ends with Moses and Aaron. So because it wants to really give us the bona fides of Moshe and Aaron. But also, interestingly enough, I think it's also to tell us that Moshe and Aaron are human beings. They're agents of God. They're doing his will, but they are not to be regarded as any kind of divinity. You know, when you look at the history, mythological history of various ancient civilizations, the founders often are described as somehow being connected with the divine, a son of a god or some kind of divine aspect to them. The Torah is making very clear that Moshe and Aaron are human beings. There's nothing about them that is divine. Yes, they're serving the divine, but they themselves are not divine. And so it gives the lineage, the human lineage going down to Moshe and Aaron. So then we have the famous scene where we have Moses tells Aaron to throw down the staff turns into a serpent, and then Pharaoh's magicians do the same thing, and then Moshe's staff swallows up theirs. And then shortly after that, we begin the story of the plagues. So the Lord says to Moses and Aaron, that's earlier, Pharaoh is still stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out to the water, the river Nile, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you the rod that turned into a snake. Right, so God says to Moshe, you're going to be performing this miraculous sign. And it's not Moshe who does it, but it's Aaron. As a matter of fact, the first three plagues are all described that Aaron, Moshe's brother, is the one who performs the act that causes the plague to come about. Dam, Svardeya, Kinin, blood, frogs, and lice. The first two plagues are with the Nile River. The third plague is with the dust of Egypt. And the Midrash plays on this, and it says that when Moshe's life was threatened, he was saved in the Nile River, right? He was put in a basket, went floating down the Nile to Pharaoh's daughter, finds him and saves him. So Moshe has a debt of gratitude, as it were, to the Nile River. And similarly, so for the first two plagues that have come from the Nile, the dam and Svardeya, the blood and the frogs, Moshe doesn't use or punish the Nile River because he owes that debt of gratitude. The third case is with the dust of the land. Remember, Moshe kills the Egyptian. He hides his body in the dust of Egypt, the dirt of Egypt. So once again, he has a kind of debt of gratitude to the dust, and therefore Moshe doesn't perform the plague, cause the plague at that time as well. And there's a certain pattern that is found in these stories. The first two plagues are always announced, and the next plague, the third plague of the series, is not announced. And during the first few plagues, we read how Pharaoh hardens his own heart. All right. So, an example in 8:15, but Pharaoh's heart stiffened that he would not heed them as the Lord had spoken. Okay? So it doesn't say, it's not God causing his heart to harden. Pharaoh's heart itself hardens, which is a symbol of stubbornness. Okay? Similarly, at the end of that chapter, chapter 8, verse 28, 38, can't read. 28, but Pharaoh became stubborn this time also and would not let the people go. Right? Finally, after the third plague, after which number plague are we at? The sixth plague. Right? The plague of boils, only then does the Torah describe it that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. The first 5 plagues, Pharaoh did his own hardening, whatever reason. From then on, God causes his heart to harden. God supports his stubbornness. The rabbis suggest that because Pharaoh initially refused to let Israel go, he was, and there was this contest, as it were, between this power of God and Pharaoh. God wanted to bring about all of the plagues then upon Egypt, and therefore Pharaoh was prevented from softening his heart. He was made more stubborn by God to make sure that he suffered all of the plagues as punishment, no longer just merely as an attempt to push him to let Israel go. And so we have this series of plagues that continue to the end of this week's Parsha, Parshat Va'era. And then we will see the conclusion of that story in the following Sedra. Okay. I want us to look at our Hebrew. Let's see, share the screen. All right, so I'd like you to no longer mute your microphone so that you can, I can hear you struggle with the Hebrew. All right, so this is page 30 that we're up to now. So it's a review, and I'd like to go through it with you. Okay, everybody, let's get unmuted so we can hear you stumbling. No. Okay, you're not stumbling, you're learning. Okay, line number 1, we have etzba.
Etzba.
By the way, etzba, that's a finger, by the way. And we find that in this week's Torah portion. As they say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, Etzba Elohim. That plague was the finger of God. That comes into that whole thing comes into play when we come to the Haggadah Passover. Okay, next word, Rachet,
Rachet,
Tarutz, Porates, Leaf Roats. All right, line number 2. Noah, Heiniah, Mincha, Chatzitz, Ruach, and the last word is Rucha. Okay, line 3. Lech, Lecha, Son. This is a real word. It means a herd of sheep. Okay. Som, Sameh. Oh, I'm hearing a sigh there. Is it that hard? Okay. I know. It's practice is the only answer. Line number 4. Yafeh, Yefet, Yaft, Ya'eh, Ya'iyah. Okay, line number 5. Gamarti, Gamarta, Gamart, Gamarten, Gamru. Actually, you're declining a verb. Gamarti, I finished. Gamarta, you masculine. Gamart, you feminine finished. Gamarten, they finished feminine. And Gamru, they finished masculine. So now you know how to conjugate at least partly the word Gamar. All right, line number 6. Nifal, Hifil, Hitpael, Pu'al, and Ufal. Those are all conjugation forms of the verbs. Snuck them in there on you. Okay, line 7. Chai, Chaim, Bayit, Beit, Ayil. I know. Notice these 2 words, Bayit, Bayit, and Beit. I did a very good job there. They're the same letters, right? Bet, Yud, Tav. This is pronounced Bayit, which means a house. Beit means house of. By changing the vowel sound, you change somewhat of the meaning of the word. The essential meaning of the word remains, but the inflection or well, this is just a noun, and this is a noun as being possessed by something else. All right. Line number 8. Bocher, Ba'a, Chayalim. All right. 9. Melech, Tzurcha, Rotzeach, Rachamim, Yenachem. Okay. Line 10. Amart, Pilpel, right? Milachim, and Lechem. Pilpel is a pepper. Anybody like hot peppers? Pilpel cham. Pilpel is a pepper. Charif. A harif, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be harif. Harif is the Hebrew for something getting a sharp taste to it. Okay, we're working on the bracha for the Shabbat candles. And so now we've got the letter Shin. Notice the letter Shin has a dot as you're looking on it on the right side, as you're looking at it. If it's looking at you, it says left. All right, you see the right side there? All right, right side means a Shin, SH sound. We'll find later on there's another version with the dot on the other side, that's Sin, which is on the left side. And the difference between Shin and Sin is that Sin is on the left, and left in Latin is sinister. All right, so that's help you. Those of you know that left is sinistra in Latin, and from which sinister comes from, you'll be able to remember that. Right now, we're just working on the Shin. So it's Sh, SH, okay, as in Shabbat. Okay, line number 1. Sh, she,
He,
she, 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 shu,
Shu,
cho.
Cho,
Line number 2. Shar,
Tar,
shame, sheen,
Shin,
Sheen,
shum,
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 shatz,
Shatz,
shelcha,
Shalcha,
Shelcha,
shuf.
Shu,
Shuf,
Line 3. Sheer,
Sheer,
sharim,
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 shalem,
Shalem,
lashon,
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 shana,
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 shoresh.
Shoresh,
Shoresh,
Line 4. Shalom,
Shalom,
shlemim,
Shleim,
shechem,
Shechem,
shibur,
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 busha.
Musha,
Usha,
Line number 5. Meet bayesh,
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 meet rachetz,
Right,
Meet Rachetz,
meet bayeshet,
Bayesh,
Meet Bayeshet,
rasha,
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 moshe.
Moshe,
Moshe.
All right, so now in older texts, older books, and even some still today, the printing was designed to make it easier for the printers, less work, what have you. So Moshe, which has the O vowel on it, on top of the mem, also is the dot for the shin to tell you it's Moshe. Okay. Now, in the Sidur that you have, the Koren, and a lot of other Sidurim today, what they do, let's see if I can try it. I can never, all right. Can I do it? No, that's not working. No, that's what I wanted to do. Let's see. Just a moment. Just a moment. It's something I did. No, that's not it. Where was that? Anyway, what we'll do today, most of the books will do today, when you have something like Moshe, there will be 2 dots here, one for the mem and one for the shin. Okay. Now, something else that they throw at you, we haven't got to Asher. We're going to come to this where you have the Chataf Patach. Right? It's really a combination of this vowel and the shva. Really, it should be a shva. We won't go into the whole grammatical issues that are involved with that. But in order to make it easier to pronounce, it takes the sound of ah. So asher, which means who or that, technically it should have been Asher, but Asher is very difficult to pronounce. And the Aleph itself has no sound that's associated with it, at least in later Hebrew. And therefore, in order to make it easier to pronounce, the was added to it. We're going to come later on to a similar one with the komats, and now I'll have to explain in a little more detail because it's a little more complicated. Okay, that was page 31. Let's go to 32. Okay, the letter kuf or kuf. And I apologize. I wasn't drinking when I did this. This doesn't always fit into my scanner very well. Okay. So kuf or kaf is always pronounced like the letter K. It's always going to be written this way. It's not going, has no tricks about it. It's always going to be a K sound. Okay, so let's look at line number 1. We have ka,
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 ke,
He,
ku,
Ku,
ko,
Ko,
ki,
Ki,
kai,
Kai,
ki,
Ki,
ki. Number 2, line number 2. Kar,
Kar,
kor,
Kor,
kash,
Kash,
ham, kots, kuf,
Ku,
hakain.
Kain,
Line number 3. Litakain,
Letakin,
Kain,
takana, tikun,
Tikun,
yakum,
Yakun,
Kum,
yafeh,
Yafe,
koshi.
Koshi,
Koshi,
All right, line number 4. Kai,
Kai,
yam,
Yam,
hayam,
Kayam,
keshet,
Keshet,
boker,
Boker,
rachot.
Rachot,
Rachot,
Line number 5. Karen,
Karen,
machon,
Nachon,
michonit,
Mecholit,
kayemet,
Kayemet,
shosh,
Shosh,
shoshana.
Shoshana,
Shoshana,
Do we have any Susans here? I don't think so. Do we have anybody's name Susan? I forget. All right, Shoshana is where Susan comes from. All right. Porates. Line 6.
Porate,
Saphon,
Zaphon,
Negba,
Negma,
Salahat,
Alahat,
Salachat, Lekach,
Lekach, Lekach, and the last word is Yitzchak,
Yitzchak,
as in Isaac, right? Yitzchak. Line 7. Likrat,
Likrat,
Lifros,
Lifrot,
Konim,
Konaim,
Liknot, note, and the last word is Takumi. Takumi.
Kumi,
So now here they decide to explain this business with the dots. Both of them. All right, one more page. The Dalet. Now, what you have to take note of, the letter Dalet, fourth letter of the alphabet, is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. In Greek, it was Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. All right, so that's the Delta, the Dalet. Notice, though, the Dalet has this little hump over here. It has a little, all right, because if you were writing it, you would write it with 2 lines that intersect. There we go. That's what I wanted before. Oh, forget it. Never do a good job. Come on. All right. But you can see here in Baruch, if we made it bigger, I'm going to make it bigger for a moment. It's a little too big. See, all right, here, see how it's rounded there? It has a curve. The Daled sticks out. Okay? So that's the difference, because those two letters, the Resh and the Daled, can be confused for each other. You have to be careful to notice the difference. By the way, one explanation as to why in the Shema, in the Shema, the letter ayin in the first word is Shema, Shin Mem Ayin. In the Torah scroll, the ayin is written large, so that you don't make a mistake between the ayin and the aleph, because some people can don't always make the distinction. And the Daled at the end of Echad, the last word of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, is also again made larger, so you don't misread it as the Reish saying Acher, one versus another. Okay. A little bit smaller. Okay. So the Daled is going to be D as in David. That's how we're going to pronounce it. In biblical Hebrew, it actually had a different pronunciation with or without a dot, but we ignore that in the modern Hebrew. Okay, so let's go down to line number 1. We have E,
E,
Day,
Day,
D,
Da,
O,
Do,
Da, Da,
Da,
Do,
Do, Day,
Day, and De.
Da,
Okay, line number 2. Dan,
Dan,
Dal,
Dal,
Lod,
Do, Lod,
Deshe,
Deshet,
Dor, Daka,
Daka,
Daf.
Da,
All right, line number 3. Darash,
Darash,
Ladrosh.
Lad Rosh,
See, notice here,
Lador,
on this one, notice how they did was they put 2 dots in here. One for the shin and one for the cholam, the O vowel. All right. Next word, Lador,
Lor,
Cheder,
Heder,
Chadarim,
Hadarim,
Degel.
Degel,
Line 4, Tzedek,
Tzedek,
Tzirtov,
Yodno,
Tzadik,
Tzadik,
Tzedakah,
Tzedakah,
Lehatzitz,
Lachatzit,
and Asher.
Esher,
Line number 5, Od,
Od,
Darshan,
Dashan,
Gadol,
Do,
Gedolim,
Dolim,
Dagesh,
Dam,
Agadah.
Dada,
Line number 6, Midrash,
Midrash,
Enosh, Darom,
Darom,
Kedem,
Kedem,
Kedima.
Kedem,
Kadima. Line 7, Dargan,
Dagan,
Gamad,
Ahmad,
Begadim,
Bagadi,
Kedusha,
Kedusha,
Mikdash.
Mikdash,
Okay, now the word Kiddushanu makes us holy or sanctified. And also it has the basic meaning of being separate, being distinct. That which is holy is distinct and separate from the rest of the world. All right, and as I've said before, Hebrew is created from 3-letter roots. And so the root of Kidshanu are these 3 letters, Kuf, Dalet, Shin. All right, so holiness is Kedusha. The holy place, the tabernacle, the temple is Mikdash. In Hebrew, we refer to the temple in Jerusalem as Beit Mikdash. or Beit HaMikdash, the holy house, the house of holiness, Beit HaMikdash. Kidshanu is not the noun form, but it is really the verb form, a combination of Kidash, Otanu. Kidshanu, God made us holy. God sanctified us through his commandments, through his mitzvot. Okay? All right.
I had one question. I was listening to this this different variations of like the Ashkenaz Nusach
Yes.
for Shacharit, and I noticed this one rabbi kept on pronouncing Eloheinu as Elokeinu, like the hey
Okay.
is pronounced as a K.
All right. Now, when we come to the name of God, everybody, I would say, the Yud Hey Vav Hey, which is regarded like the personal name of God, we don't say except in prayer. You guys are practicing still, and so I expect you to say Adonai when we're reading it, okay? But if you were practicing on your own, just practicing, for example, if I were practicing preparing a Torah reading, when I would come, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Lemor, I would say Vayomer Hashem or Ad Hashem, I would not say Adonai. Okay? Now, some are also strict, especially in Orthodox circles, when it comes to the forms of Elohim. Now, Elohim, God, or Eloheinu, our God, can be holy. It can be a reference to the one God. It can be a reference to the pagan gods. There's no distinction between them in terms of spelling or pronunciation. But many, when they are practicing a blessing and don't want to say God in that way, they will say Elokeinu. Instead of Eloheinu, Elokeinu. Just like Ad Hashem, some would say, instead of Adonai, they'll say Ad Hashem or Hashem. Similarly, they would say Elokeinu or Elokim instead of Elohim or Eloheinu. Okay, it's not an Ashkenazi pronunciation issue. It's an issue on how you approach pronouncing different names of God. Last week we talked about, we didn't talk about Sefer Vayikra, Leviticus, did we? I was supposed to, I didn't. Okay. I just want to touch on a little bit there before we go to the last two books of the Torah. Leviticus, its name in English, is taken from the Latin, which is associating with the Levites, with the clergy, with the priests, because much of Leviticus concerns priestly actions, the sacrifices especially. And what I want to point to and understand, we moderns have a great deal of difficulty understanding the concept of sacrifice. By the way, even in the Middle Ages, Maimonides himself, the philosopher, the decisive Jewish law, had to deal with the whole issue of sacrifice, because in the pagan world, sacrifices were understood as actually having effect upon the gods. I think I may have mentioned it to you in Babylonian mythology. There's a work called the Numa Elish. And in it, there's a parallel story to the story of Noah. And in that, of course, we have gods instead of a single god. And when Utnapishtim, who's the hero of that story, is the one who is saved, the gods are all hungry because there are no human beings to feed them because of the flood. So when Utnapishtim is saved from the catastrophe in the Babylonian flood story, and he offers up sacrifices, the gods swarm around the smoke like flies. That's how it's described, because they see it as sustenance. And indeed, many of the elements of the Jewish version of sacrificial system has elements that clearly owe to this pagan conception of what sacrifices were about. The tabernacle in many ways is like God's house. And he has an altar for incense, and he has an altar for bread, the showbread as it's called, and he has the altar where the blood was put on the in front of the ark, and where he spoke from on top of the ark. So one can certainly see parallels in this whole imagery to paganism. Now, we firmly believe that God does not need sacrifices. Many of the prophets even seem to condemn sacrifices. We'll see later on, perhaps. But certainly they are not essential to God. They were essential to us. They were not essential to God. So Maimonides, the rationalist, has to explain, so why did Israel have a sacrificial system? And so he sees it as instrumental. He says, really, we would be better, he doesn't say exactly this way, he's saying, we really don't need it. We'd be better off without it. But here are these people. They're fresh out of Egypt. They come to Mount Sinai. They're about to establish the new nation of Israel. And they are to listen to Moshe's commands that come from God, to worship only one God, that there are no multiplicity of gods, there's only one. And how could, if you told them, not only do you have to believe there's only one God, but we're going to worship him not the way our neighbors do with sacrifices, but through prayer. They wouldn't understand what was going on. They needed the sacrificial system as kind of a bridge to help bring them out of paganism into monotheism. So the Rambam Maimonides suggests that really sacrifices served only that purpose. They don't have any value in and of themselves. Now, he doesn't say that the sacrificial system won't be restored in the third temple, and that's a whole story for another day. But he makes clear that he doesn't see value in and of themselves to the sacrificial system. Now, someone who comes a generation or so after him, the Ramban Nachmanides, who is a mystic and not a rationalist, argues very vehemently on Maimonides. And he says there is purpose and reason for the sacrifices, and they have a certain level of efficacy through the performance of those mitzvot. And so he says, really, when we sacrifice an animal, we're saying we ourselves, our lives are forfeit for what we've done wrong. And so we substitute the life of the animal that is being sacrificed for our life. So he expresses an idea that there is some meaningfulness to sacrifices beyond what Maimonides is trying to say. The Jewish liturgy has maintained the idea that sacrifices had some kind of effect or meaningful effect. In a sense, that's how we, in the ancient world, when the temple existed, we atoned for our sins through the sacrificial system. Just a second. Oh, you're making noise. And so that even in the prayer service, after the temple's destroyed, the traditional prayers retained a request for the restoration of the temple in Israel, in Jerusalem, and the reinstitution of the sacrificial system. And the rabbis already in the Talmud are of different minds as to what's going to take place in the third temple. Will there be sacrifices? Will there be only grain sacrifices? There are different voices that are heard. And see, even today, there are some within the Orthodox world who will say, well, they're not going to be really sacrifices in the third temple. There will be something else. We'll leave that up to God. That's one thing. So one thing to understand is the sacrificial system was a means. I like Maimonides' attempt to explain it as a means of weaning us away from idolatry, but he uses that as an explanation for a lot of Jewish customs and practices, Jewish laws. And that we don't believe that God in any way needed these sacrifices, although they're very anthropomorphic in their description. That is a sweet smell, sweet odor of the flames, of the fumes of the fire that go up to God. But in the end, they are symbolic, as it were. You also have to understand that there are different kinds of sacrifices. We're not going to go through them, but if you look, especially in the book of Leviticus, some sacrifices are what we call a korban olah. That was a sacrifice that the animal was slaughtered. Its blood was placed on certain parts of the altar. And then the entirety of the animal was burned on the pyre that was on top of the altar. Right? Total burnt offering. There were some sacrifices that were called shlamim, peace offerings. And there are other offerings as well. I'm going to the other extreme in the with the peace offering, that the shlamim, the innards, were burnt on the altar, parts of the animal that we really don't eat anyway. Certain fats, forbidden fats, were burnt on the altar. Blood was put on the altar. But the rest of the animal was eaten by priests and by the person who brought the sacrifice. It was a holy meal that symbolically you would be sharing with God. Just like the Passover sacrifice that we'll come to in the spring. Passover sacrifice, the animal was consumed by the person who offered it. Only the blood was put on the altar. So the sacrificial system contained within it also an element of sharing a meal, as it were, with God. And we all know that the best way to get to know somebody is not over Zoom, but around the dinner table. That's where we really get to know people, to speak and share things. And the sharing of a meal together is always, in most cultures, regarded as an extremely important social activity. So remember that. And then some of the sacrifices were just meal offerings. In other words, flour that was used in some way on the altar. Sometimes just as pure flour. Sometimes it was baked into loaves of some kind. And furthermore, the Torah itself recognizes there's a difference in what a person can do. A rich person can bring a sacrifice from cattle, a large animal. Someone less well off would bring a sacrifice for the same thing from a goat or a sheep. Some people might bring for that same sacrifice birds, doves, and some who could only afford flour would bring a meal offering. And when it describes the sacrifice of the meal offering in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra in Leviticus, we find the passage. Oh boy. It's the beginning of chapter 2. When a person presents an offering of grain to the Lord, his offering shall be made of choice flour. He should pour oil on it, lay frankincense on it, and present it to Aaron's sons, the priests. Now, one of the problems often with modern translations, this is the translation found in Eitz Chaim, which is the JPS translation, is that sometimes in order to catch the true meaning of a word, you miss what the Bible is really saying. I really believe that here. Because, let me see if I find how the Art Scroll translates it. Oops, too far. So the Art Scroll translates it, when a person offers a meal offering to Hashem, okay, it's the same translation. My mistake. But what I want to point out is the Hebrew is literally, the word used is nephesh. Now the word nephesh can be a person, as both translations prefer to translate it here. But nephesh can mean a soul, a life. God breathes into Adam, nefesh becomes a living, breathing entity. And so the Midrash, the rabbis in the Talmud say, what's going on here? Who is the person who's going to bring this the poorest, cheapest of sacrifices? A poor person, because they can't afford anything more than that. And yet God accords it to them as if they offered their very life, their own soul, their nephesh. Because each person can only do it in accordance with what their ability is. And so the sacrifice of the poor individual, which might be simply a handful of flour, was the equivalent in God's eyes to the large cattle that the rich person brought. If the rich person brought a meal offering, that would not be acceptable because they can afford much more. And as we know, unfortunately, in human beings, we tend to look at the amount of money spent in order to give credit to something. But we know that some people, when they make a donation of tzedakah, for lack of a better term, I'll translate as charity, somebody might be able to give away $1 million and hardly feel it. Somebody might give $10, and that's a stretch in their budget. And therefore, the $10 donation might be even superior in the eyes of God to the $1 million donation. We, of course, we want the money and all the organizations, so they honor the person who gives lots of money. Well, you know, it's human nature. We have to do what we have to do to raise funds. But we should never forget that it is as important as how much of what that person can afford to give as to how much they give. And so Vayikra recognizes that. There are a number of different sacrifices or different kinds of things for certain inadvertent violations of Jewish law. By the way, you can only bring a sacrifice as an atonement if you didn't mean to do it. In other words, you meant to do the act, but either you didn't know the act was forbidden, or you didn't know that that you were violating something. For example, on Shabbat, if you violated a law of Shabbat in the ancient world, you're supposed to bring a sacrifice to the temple. Now, if you intentionally did it, says, I know it's Shabbat, and I'm going to build a bonfire anyway, then you're we call mazid, you're intentional sinner, and you can't bring a sacrifice as a kapara, as an atonement. If you didn't realize it was Shabbat and you built a fire, or you knew it was Shabbat, but you didn't know that it was forbidden to build a fire on Shabbat, that's an inadvertent transgression. And for that, you would bring a sacrifice as an atonement. So that is part and parcel of what Sefer Vayikra is trying to tell us.
I just want to ask like a practical question. So I know like the poor offerings versus the rich offerings obviously would be different, but you know, if you are following the mitzvot exactly, like how the height of the actual offerings that the average person was actually making, like the Rosh Chodesh offerings, like the number of like things you were supposed to slaughter.
Okay.
Like otherwise you're burning like
The
half of your
sacrificial
herd
system,
every single day.
okay, the sacrificial system works this way. There are certain sacrifices that were communal sacrifices. All the holiday sacrifices that we read about were communal. They would bring one, trying to remember the passage out by heart, that you would bring an animal as a sacrifice for the new moon. Only one for the whole community, for all of Israel. Each one of us doesn't bring a korban, a sacrifice. Right? That, by the way, is the explanation that we read about the idea of bringing every male had to bring a half shekel for the temple. And that shekel, half shekel was used with all the monies were used, collected from the men, because they were the ones that had the money, really, in the ancient world, to buy the communal sacrifices. So we all had a share in those communal sacrifices. The sacrifices that an individual brought were only those that had to do directly with them. If they did something wrong, or they want to show thanksgiving to God, you had something special happen to you. A woman who gave birth would bring a sacrifice after a certain period of time. All of those are because things that are dealing directly with you, something you did or something you experienced, that was when you brought a sacrifice. Right? So the ordinary person, assuming he didn't do anything wrong, which is a big assumption, might not bring any sacrifices in the course of a year. Right? If he wanted to celebrate something, he would. And also remember, in the ancient world, about the only time people ate meat was when they brought a sacrifice. Before refrigeration, cattle were mostly used for hauling things or plowing. You didn't raise beef cattle. Goats more often might be eaten, goats and sheep, but even they were not eaten very often. Similarly, even with birds, chickens. Chickens laid eggs. You didn't want to, the rooster might get his head chopped off because you didn't need any roosters around too much, or not too many roosters. But people didn't eat meat that much. So the only one of the times they would eat it would be when they brought a sacrifice. And so the Thanksgiving offerings were sort of like, that's the Jewish version of Thanksgiving. You bring an offering to the temple, was brought part on the altar and part you took home to eat. You had to eat in Jerusalem, but that was the way it went. Except for the Passover sacrifice. Okay? That answer your question? So don't worry.
Like when it would say like for the monthly offerings, 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs a year.
That was all.
So that would be
public.
And so it was just like people would donate one from their herd add to.
No, what they did was for those communal offerings, you couldn't offer it. Not that. It had to be purchased from the communal funds. And since everybody, rich and poor, each gave only a half shekel, nobody gave more than anybody else for the communal offerings. Now, there are other things. You could make donations to the Beit HaMikdash. You could offer special sacrifices if you want additional sacrifices, if you want, and usually those are Thanksgiving offerings. You're thanking God for your good fortune or what have you. Right? But all the ones that talk about the sacrifices for the holidays, all the ones that talk about the sacrifices for the new moon, all of those were communal offerings brought from communal funds. All right. Now, one other thing in Leviticus I just want to touch briefly upon. We have a whole discussion about what is usually translated into English as leprosy. Okay? Now, leprosy is not what the biblical account is all about. And the rabbis struggled with understanding what it was completely, and they assumed it was a kind of punishment that one got for speaking evil of other people. And so all of this discussion about leprosy that we find in the Torah is really a special case that we don't see in our world. It was only something that was associated with the way the rabbis explain it, the direct different relationship that ancient Israel had with God. And so when a person would do something wrong by slandering someone, saying gossip about somebody else, they might suffer leprosy. Because what do you do when you slander someone? You kind of make it so that people don't want to have anything to do with them. And so you, as we call midah keneged midah, measure for measure, you cause somebody to be excluded from the community by your language, by your slander, by your words. So you too are separated from the community as a punishment for that. Right? So we have to understand it as that way. If you want, it's not leprosy as we understand leprosy to be, or Hansen disease as it's called today. It is something totally different. Okay, excuse me. All right, the fourth book of the Torah in English is called Numbers, Book of Numbers, Hebrew Sefer B'Midbar, because it talks about Israel in the Midbar, in the wandering in the wilderness. It's called Numbers because it opens with a census. There's a counting of the people of Israel, the opening of the Midbar, and so that's how it got its Greek name, which eventually becomes Numbers in English. All right. And there are a number of different stories in it that I want to touch upon two of them. One is the story of how when Israel sends out spies to check out the Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And these spies come back to Moses and they say, well, it's a great place to go in the sense of it's fertile, the crops are nice and everything, but the people are too strong for us. There's no way we can conquer them. Therefore, we shouldn't even try. So 10 of the 12 say that. 2 of the 12, the heroes of the story, Joshua and Caleb, say, no, have faith in God. We can do it. After all, they've experienced the crossing of the sea. They beat the Egyptian army, was defeated by God. Why can't God help them cross over and make it into the land? But the people lose heart and they grow faint and they doubt God's ability. And that is when they are cursed and they have to be in the wilderness for 40 years as a result of their loss of faith that they could conquer the land. Now, a couple of things. It says 40 years. 40 itself is a number that is used all the time to express a large number. 40 days and 40 nights, 40 this, 40 that. It may not always be taken literally as 40. because this is already the second year after they've left Egypt, and they're only going to be there another 38, so they're not 40 years, unless you count back from the time they left Egypt, which was not part of the punishment, that was added on. But in any case, that's why the Israelites are left wandering in the Midbar for 40 years, because they lost hope. And it was clear that a people who had been slaves and not known freedom would not be capable of taking the actions that were necessary in order to conquer the land of Israel. And there are two other stories that I want to take note of. One is the Rebellion of Korach. As every society, there's always going to be disputes, disruption. We're told how Korach was not happy that Moses was the leader and his brother Aaron was the high priest, and other members of his family had other positions and thought it was nepotism, and he should have some of these jobs. The two came from the same overall family. He was a Levite as well. And there's a revolt, and Moshe says, "What do you want from me? I didn't do anything. This is all God's doing, essentially." And Korach and his followers, Moshe says, if they die in an ordinary manner, okay, but if they die in a special way, you'll know that God sent me, and it's not my responsibility here. And so the earth opens up its mouth and swallows Korach and all of his group, all of his community, all of his fellow rebels. Interestingly enough, we have in the book of Psalms, a couple of places say means more surely B'nai Korach, a song or psalm of the sons or for the sons of Korach. So the rabbi said his sons did teshuvah, they repented. And while their father died, they themselves did not die. They weren't swallowed up by the earth. Either there was a ledge that popped up and they managed to fall onto the ledge and then later on got out or what have you. But they repented while their father had not. And the other story is the story of Bilam and Balak. Balak is the king of Moab, Midian, excuse me. And we're told that this is now after the 40 years of wandering, and Israel's begun the process of drawing near to the land of Israel. So he was, Moab, king of Moab. And he was alarmed that people was so numerous, and he dreaded the Israelites. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, "Now this horde will lick clean all that is about us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to Bilam, son of Beor in Petor, which is by the Euphrates, to the land in the land of his kinfolk, to invite him. Saying, all right, so we have here a man by the name of Balak. He's the king of Moab. He sends messengers to a man, in Hebrew it's Bilam. It's usually is spelled Balaam, just like Balak. I don't know how that Balaam came in there. But Balak and Bilam, Bilam is a prophet. He's a non-Jewish prophet. He has the fame of being able to curse people, and those curses come about. And so Balak wants Bilam to come and curse the Israelites. And so Bilam doesn't really seem to hesitate. I mean, he's not unhappy with it, but he says, I got to find out if this is what God wants of me. All right. So it says to them, "Spend the night here," to the messengers, "and I shall reply to you as the Lord may instruct me." So the Moabite dignitaries stayed with Bilam. God came to Bilam and said, "What do these people want of you?" So here's a couple of important elements. First of all, the idea that prophecy was not limited to the Jewish people, contrary to what some say. Secondly, we see here in the story of Bilam that prophecy was often in the form of dreams. We had it with the story of Joseph, that the prophet waits upon God's word that is going to come to him at night in his dream, because that's what is going on. He says to the messengers, wait, I'll tell you in the morning. And God comes to him at night in his dreams. Bilam said to God, Balak son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent me this message. Here's a people that came from da 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 da. You know, I should curse them. So God said to Bilam, do not go with them. You must not curse the people, for they are blessed. So Bilam gets up in the morning, tells the messenger, sorry, I can't do it. They go back to Balak. Balak is not happy. He sends the messengers back with more gifts and more offers of money. And they come to Bilam the second time. And Bilam replied to Balak's officials, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything big or little contrary to the command of the Lord my God. So you two stay here overnight and let me find out what else the Lord may say to me. So again, he says a couple of things here. And if you listen carefully, he's really haggling for a price. A house full of gold and silver, et cetera, et cetera. But even that price, I can only do it if God lets me do it. So now we might think, okay, God's going to let him do it. And that's what he's going to tell him in the morning. God came to me last night. Said, okay, go make a fortune and curse these people. That night, God came to Bilam and said to him, if these men have come to invite you, you may go with them. But whatever I command you, that you shall do. So God says, okay, you want to go? Go. But remember, you can only say what I tell you to say. But you know, it's almost like, that's clearly from what happens in the story next. It's almost like, you know, a parent says to a child, well, if you really want to do this, when you know very well the parent is saying, don't you dare do this. But if you really want to do it, all right, well, go ahead and do it. But no. So the kid knows. No, usually that's for an older kid like you guys. They'll say they know that the parent doesn't really want them to do it, but the parent feels constrained to let them do what they want to do. And if they were really smart, they wouldn't do it, but they go ahead and do it. So Bilam sets out, and what's not clear, and I'll come back in a moment, when he rose in the morning, Bilam saddled his ass and departed with the Moabite dignitaries. Right? But God was incensed at his going. So an angel of the Lord placed himself in the way as an adversary. So he says he's going with all these other guys, and all of a sudden they disappear from the story. There's just him and his ass. He was riding on his she-ass with his two servants alongside. When the angel caught sight of when the ass caught sight of the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, the ass swerved between the road and went into the fields. And Bilam beat the ass to turn him back onto the road. You know, you can see this even still today in Israel. You'll see sometimes they're especially with Arabs from some villages. You know, they're riding a donkey and they will give it a good slap to get it to move in the right direction. All right. So Bilam pushed him back. The angel of the Lord then stationed himself in a lane between the vineyards with a fence on either side. The ass, seeing the angel of the Lord, pressed herself against the wall and squeezed Bilam's foot against the wall. So he beat her again. Once more, the angel of the Lord moved forward and stationed himself on a spot so narrow that there's no room to swerve right or left. When the ass now saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Bilam, and Bilam was furious and beat the ass with his stick. Then the Lord opened the ass's mouth, and she said to Bilam, what have I done to you that you have beat me these 3 times? Bilam said to the ass, you have made a mockery of me. If I had a sword with me, I'd kill you. The ass said to Bilam, look, I'm the ass you've been riding all along until this day. Have I ever been in the habit of doing this to you? And he answered, no. Then the Lord uncovered Bilam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way. his drawn sword in his hands, whereupon he bowed right down to the ground. The angel of the Lord said to him, why have you beaten your ass these 3 times? It is I who came out as an adversary, for the errand is obnoxious to me. And when the ass saw me, she shied away because of me these 3 times. If she had not shied away from me, you are the one I should have killed, while sparing her. So here you have this man who claims to be a prophet. He's going to go do the bidding of Balak. His donkey, his ass, sees an angel and he can't see it. And then, without any surprise on the part of Bilam, the ass starts talking to him. You know, without, we think before he starts saying, why did you do this? He might say, since when can you talk? How come you ever spoke to me until now? So the rabbis are divided on how understanding this. Maimonides, again, the rationalist, says this is all a dream. Never was, never will be. There really wasn't this kind of an episode. It's another one of the dreams that Bilam has to tell him what is right and wrong. Others say, no, it really happened. It was true. And it was part of the miracle of creation, that when God created the world, it built into it this talking mule, this talking ass. So anyway, once again, Bilam is told only what God tells you to say, you can say. And so he goes to Balak, and he tells Balak exactly that. And he says, all right, show me where Israel is. It takes them to a place. They make altars, they make sacrifices to God. And Bilam wants to offer up a curse. Instead, he praises Israel. Balak is upset and with Bilam, and Bilam says, what do you want from me? This is what God told me to say. He says, we'll take another place and builds other altars and other sacrifices. And Bilam gets up there to curse Israel. And once again, out comes a blessing. 3rd time, I think would be the charm. They set up a place, altars, sacrifices. And this time Bilam praises Israel, famously the lines, Matovo Alecha Yaakov Mishkanotecha Yisrael, the words we're supposed to recite when we enter into the synagogue, how goodly your tents are Israel, your dwelling places, Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And then Balak's not very happy. Bilam says, tell you what, I'll tell you what's going to happen to everybody. And he tells the fate of all these people, that they're going to be destroyed. Bilam goes on his way, Balak goes on his way. Later on, Bilam meets his end because of his involvement with all of this, and Balak too, when he is conquered. All right. The last book of the Torah, Sefer Devarim, Eila Devarim, these are the words that Moses spoke to Israel. It's mostly described as Moses giving farewell speeches to the children of Israel. And he reviews everything that has taken place, reviews some of the laws of mitzvot. That's why it's called in Latin, Deuteronomy. Deutero means second, a repetition. Nomia is law. The second law, or the repetition of the law. And in Hebrew, it's called Devarim, although also it's referred to by the rabbis as Mishnah Torah, which means a repetition of the Torah, second Torah. And a lot of the passages in Sefer Devarim parallel, they add to, they differ a little bit from passages that we found elsewhere. And so part of the rabbinic tradition is to square the book of Devarim, Sefer Devarim, with other books of the Torah. One of the most important things that is repeated is the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. We were going to get to that in a couple of weeks in the synagogue, but I want to go over with you a little bit right now. The Aseret HaDibrot in Hebrew, it means the 10 statements. If the Bible wanted to call it the 10 Commandments, it would have been called Asara Mitzvot, Eser Mitzvot. Asara Mitzvot. It's not Aseret Mitzvot. It's Aseret Dibrot. Mitzvah means commandments. Devarim, words, statements. And indeed, when people struggle understanding what exactly these Aseret Dibrot are, they find that some of them don't seem to be a mitzvah. They have to read into it a mitzvah. So that in Exodus, it says, God spoke all these words saying, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall know it, I'm your God. That is the first of the statements. Right? Then we're told, other gods, do not make any idols. Right? Then we're told, I'm sorry. First one, I am the Lord your God. You have no other gods before me. You shall make no idols. That's 3. You shall observe the Sabbath day. You honor your parents. Right? I'm sorry, I skipped. Well, I know it. There it is. I'm Lord your God, brought you out of the land. No other gods beside me. Can't make idols. Can't take God's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath and honor your parents. Honor your father and your mother. Right? And then the second set of 5 are you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, etc. Okay, so those are the set of Dibrot. And roughly they're the same in Deuteronomy, but there's some significant differences in language. So that the first major difference, and we'll see, look at, get the parallel passage in Deuteronomy. I just want to look at a couple of differences, all right? In Exodus, it says, Zachor Yom Shabbat L'Kodesho. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That opens up in Deuteronomy, Shamoret Yom Shabbat L'Kodesho. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Right? In Exodus, it continues, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. And on the 7th day will be a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not perform any kind of work. You, your son, daughter, male, female servants, your animals, a stranger who's in your gates. In Exodus, it says, after you shall keep it holy, as the Lord God commanded you, 6 days shall you work and perform all your work. And the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. Don't do any kind of work. There are minor differences here between those two. Major difference is the Shamor and Zachor. In Exodus, we're told Zachor, remember the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy, we're told Shemoret Yom HaShabbat, observe the Sabbath day. And then at the end, in Exodus, it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and seas and all that is in them. And he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So in Exodus, we're told the rationale for Shabbat is creation. In Deuteronomy, he says, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. The Lord your God freed you from from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. In Exodus, it's cosmic. God created the universe. God hallowed the universe, hallowed the Sabbath day because of the commemoration of that you should make. In Deuteronomy, as you should remember, you were slaves. You were freed from bondage. And therefore, you have to observe the Sabbath day because of God's salvation. So it's because God saved you. So it's a more personal, direct to the people to do it. And we have a social construct here, a societal construct. The Sabbath is meant for society. You're not supposed to work 7 days a week. You need a day of rest, a recuperation of spiritual rest. Right? There come up other differences that we're going to go into. But so how do we explain the differences? Now, remember I mentioned last week, there was a course that we call the documentary hypothesis. For those who accept that kind of reading of the biblical heritage, no problem. This is from one tradition, that's from a different tradition. They had different sources, and therefore they don't agree in the wording. Essentially, they're the same, but they don't. That you don't have to deal with trying to make them meet each other. Jewish tradition says, and in the words of Lecha Dodi, on Friday night, the hymn we sing, Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Panei Shabbat Nekabala, come greet the Sabbath bride. It says in the very first stanza, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad hishmianu el hamyuchad. Observe and remember, Shamor v'zachor, it was said in one word. The one God made us hear it simultaneously. So many of the traditional commentaries understand it means that somehow miraculously God was able to say, and Moses is able to hear both versions simultaneously, and one gets written down in Exodus and one gets written down in Deuteronomy. Ibn Ezra is a little more almost modern in his approach, saying essentially the same thing. The words are different because Moshe is recording it now, and it's his speech he's giving now, and so he's giving it some in his own words, as it were. But they're really the same thing, just you don't get hung up on the difference in the words. The Shema paragraph and the Hayim Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema, are found in Deuteronomy. Many different laws and things that are important, but we're not going to go through them. And of course, as I mentioned last time, it ends with the death of Moshe, and Deuteronomy thus ends the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And because it was seen in tradition as being dictated, as it were, by God to Moshe, that gives the 5 books of Moses this higher level, is regarded greater sanctity. Because, as I point out with Bilam, when it comes to prophecy, for everybody else, we see often that it has something to do with dreams, going to sleep at night, visions at night, all this kind of thing. Moshe is described in the Torah as speaking face to face to God. Not in dreams, but in a personal, some kind of direct communication with the divine, by the prophets or otherwise. So that this takes, in the synagogue, if we read from the Torah as part of the ritual, we have to read it from a Torah scroll. If you read the prophetic reading, while some synagogues may have scrolls that have the prophecies written on them, most synagogues read it from a book. so it's high, and the prophets is a higher level sanctity than the writings. So that, for example, if I have three sections, if I have just the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and I have another book that is just as prophets, and another book that is writings. If I want to pile them up, the book on the bottom is going to be writings, Ketuvim. Next book will be prophets, Nevi'im, and on top will be the Torah. That sanctity that inherent in them. There are a couple of parts that I forgot to mention, that some explain some of the differences are because Moses is speaking versus God speaking directly. When it comes to the 10 Commandments, right, we know that at least it's described as Moses hears the first 2, and everybody hears the first 2, and then the people are frightened. They tell Moses, enough already, you get the rest of them for us. And some even go to say that, when we look at the account of the 10 Commandments, really the only thing that the people really heard was the first letter of the first word. The first letter of the first word is Anochi. The first letter is an Aleph, and we don't pronounce the Aleph. They heard the unpronounced letter. That's all they heard. We know that on one hand, we're told that Israel accepted the Torah willingly. The Midrash, because it says Israel stood Tachtit Ahar, which really means they stood at the foot of the mountain. But a Midrash suggests, well, I'm not so sure about that, and says that God lifted Mount Sinai over their heads so that they were literally under Tachtit, under the mountain. And God said, if you accept my Torah, fine. If you don't accept my Torah, I'm going to let go. And this will be your grave. So that's not exactly accepting it so willingly. So later on, the story of Mordechai and Esther, Megillah and Esther, they say Israel accepted the Torah willingly later on. Oh, those are there. The Torah scroll itself is a holy book. We treat it with respect. It's on rollers in most synagogues, all synagogues today. We don't touch it with our hands because we don't want to get oil and grease onto the parchment, because they could cause the letters to come off in some way. And so that's all part and parcel of what the Torah means. So now remember, all the way back in the beginning, the word Torah has many shades of meaning. Torah can mean the 5 books of Moses, meaning just the content. Torah can mean the literal scroll. Torah can mean the teachings of God, and sometimes is used to refer to the entire Bible. And sometimes Torah is used to refer to all of Jewish learning and all that's involved with it. Okay, any questions tonight?
Yeah, I had one question. It was sort of related to what you were talking about. You were going over the 10 Commandments, but I was listening to this like lecture thing, and they were talking. The rabbi was talking about like a prohibition against intercessors being read from the I guess the 2nd commandment, with like graven images and things like that, and not having an intercessor and intermediaries and stuff like that. And it was sort of being used as part of the criticism against sort of Christian interpretations and ideas about the Messiah and things like that. And I was just curious because when I was looking in Safaria, I couldn't figure out what actually in the Hebrew translated to that word intercessor, or because I know in other parshas, the idea of Moses praying for Israel or praying on behalf of the people.
Now let's understand, they're 2 different things. Moses may pray for Israel. Okay? I may pray for your good health. You don't pray to me asking me and to pray to God. And you don't address me as the one who is approaching God. Havdil, that Elef Havdalah, as they say, to make a distinction. What the line in the New Testament, nobody comes to the Father except through the Son, or something along those lines, right? You have to go through Jesus in order to approach God. All right? But you'll have no other gods beside me. It may be that they're referring to that, no other gods, as intercessors in that sense.
Okay.
Now we have hints of that kind of thing in certain Jewish texts, but it's really frowned upon by most Jewish tradition, that we don't look to somebody as an intermediary, that we almost worship them or speak to them to carry our prayer to God. One of the problems with Chassidut is that some saw in the Hasidic concept of the tzaddik, of the Rebbe of the Hasidic group, almost an intermediary kind of entity. But we clearly, Jewish tradition sees that we pray only to God. We don't pray to anything else. We don't ask any element of however you envision the divine court. Remember, anthropomorphisms are rampant throughout the Bible. And they are a result of the human need to somehow envision God. And so in the ancient world, what would you compare God to if not to an earthly king? Well, an earthly king has his retinue, it has all these agents and all these things around him. And so images of God's court and God's retinue, God's counsel, all these things pop up. There's a result of the human need to anthropomorphize that which cannot be envisioned. And so sometimes people gave into that and talk about Abraham praying to God for his children, or Ruth, especially Rivka, Rachel praying for her children. And those are there, but that's not to mean that we would be permitted in our prayers. We don't have any prayer that addresses anyone but God. You shall give us strength. You shall give us wisdom. You shall forgive us. You shall appoint the true righteous judges, or restore justice to the world. No intermediary, no go-between between us and God.
And so how did that fit into, like, because the other thing, I think, remember you were, I think it was you or if it was somebody else that was mentioning it, but there's the practice of some people, if they can't make it to services to say Kaddish, they might pay somebody to say Kaddish for them or something like that.
All right, because now, Kaddish is a blessing of God. It's a ritual, it's a mitzvah to sanctify the name of God in public. I can sometimes do a mitzvah through somebody else. For example, we're supposed to read Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, on Purim. Most people don't read it. They go to the synagogue and they hear somebody in the synagogue reading it. And by us listening to it, we fulfill the mitzvah. We're supposed to hear the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We don't necessarily blow the shofar. So some things can be done for us. Some things cannot be done for us. Right? I cannot have you wear a talit for me. I have to wear the talit. There's no way I can perform the mitzvah without putting on the talit. Right? If I eat an animal, it has to be shechted, slaughtered kosherly. Well, I can't do that, but a shochet does. So he performs the mitzvah. It's not directly for me, as it were. It's a little bit different, but nonetheless, before I can eat the meat, the animal must be slaughtered properly. So some things can be done, but not intermediary. not between us. I don't say, Moshe Rabbeinu, go to God, Moshe, who has died all those centuries ago. I pray to you that you should address God. And and for sure, that is a contrary to, say, Catholic practice of praying to a saint, where they directly say to the saint that they should intercede on their behalf. Yeah. Any other questions?
Rabbi, I have a question. You kind of touched on this a little bit. I know that Misha and I have spoke previously about the Rebbe and how some people will do like a pilgrimage to his grave.
Yeah.
And they will essentially use him as like an emissary to speak to God on their behalf.
Okay. I am not a chassid. I think that what they're doing is wrong. There's all kinds of issues that one might have with what's happened with the story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There is a Talmudic idea that you go by the graveside of family or go by a graveside of a righteous person to offer prayers to God. And there, even in that in general, is kind of looked down upon by many authorities because it looks like you're asking them to be an intermediary. Most certainly, going to a grave of anyone and asking them to intercede on your behalf, I think is avodah zarah. It's idolatrous. Maimonides for sure would say that that is a forbidden practice. So they have to defend their practice. I don't have to okay it.
I see. I also am curious, like I know that some people, for example, when the Rebbe was alive, he like gave out certain like dollar bills, and it's like a really
those are kinds of blessings and special things. You know, look, every tradition in the world sees certain people as having a higher level of sanctity and piety, and sometimes they see them as being conduits for God's blessings, as it were. Just like a parent blesses their children on Friday night. I'm not in lieu of God. I'm offering a blessing that is found in the Torah. That God, Yorech Hashem Yishmerecha, may God bless you and watch over you. I'm not really blessing them. Not really. What I'm doing is I'm asking God to bless them. So too, the idea of, the Rebbe would give you $1 and then you would take that $1 and you would give it to tzedakah. So you become, first of all, you would be giving tzedakah, and you would become an agent for somebody else's performance in the midst of giving tzedakah. That seems to be the origins of it. But yes, especially in Chabad, towards the end of his life, despite all the wonderful things that the Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, did, there were some issues. There were some real problems. And his followers, and many of them still till today, went on a path that is very, very dangerous. And there was an Orthodox scholar who wrote a book all on this issue and taking them to task, and they were not very happy with that. Right? I remember I reviewed the book at my synagogue one time, and one of the local Hasidic rabbis, one of the Lubavitchers, asked me not to do it. He didn't want it to be discussed. Okay? But yeah, and even till today, there are some circles of Hasidim of Lubavitch nature who there are Orthodox rabbis who say you should not daven with them because they went past the pale on that issue. So I'm not trying to cause troubles, but that's the reality. Anybody else? Now maybe I should censor this part of the class and not publicize it. I can get into trouble. I don't know. Who knows? I can get in trouble for anything I say on this thing. Okay. All right. Next week, we will start looking at the next section of the Bible. namely the Nevi'im, the early prophets, former prophets, historical works, etc. Okay, until then, I'll say goodnight. Robert, would you still stay on after everybody leaves?
Sure, okay.
Okay, so I'm going to ask everybody just to sign yourself off because Robert is another student who's with us tonight, and I just want to talk to him. Okay, be well. Goodbye.
Shabbat
Salam.
shalom.
Hitraot. Au revoir.
Shabbat
Via
shalom.
con Dios. Hasta luego. We're almost there.
Okay, are we okay now?
Yeah, they disappeared or they forgot to turn themselves off, but I think should be okay. I'm going to turn off the recording though. Wait a second.
Okay.